Hello and welcome to another anatomy video, and today we'll be finishing up all the terms found in the CNS. Now in the last video I circled the different areas of the brain. We have the cerebrum, we have the diencephalon, we have the thalamus, and I also circled the mesencephalon, which is what will be covered today. Now yesterday I over-circled the region and where the mesencephalon or the midbrain is located. The mesencephalon doesn't occupy too much space in the brain. It is located right here where I have it in red. This right here is the mesencephalon. Within the mesencephalon, we have a bunch of different landmarks that we're going to learn. The first one I want to point out is called the mesencephalic tectum, which means the roof of the mesencephalon, and that's located right here where I'm shading. Now before I go ahead and finish out all the different landmarks found in the mesencephalon, I just want to go ahead and point out the other major landmarks that we can see in this image. This large bulb kind of poking out off of the brainstem has a name. This large mass is called the pons. Now the second largest part of the brain is this entire area right here. This is the cerebellum. And then this section located right here is going to be the medulla oblongata. Awesome, those are all the major landmarks that we can see in this image, but let's go ahead and return to the mesencephalon and look at other landmarks located on it. In this image, we have removed the cerebellum from the model, and we can look at the posterior aspect of the mesencephalon. We already identified this structure right here, which is the mesencephalic tectum, which I'll rewrite. But within this mesencephalic tectum, we have a few more landmarks. The first one being this little circular bulb right here, and there's one on the contralateral side. So right here we have one, and right here we have one. These are called superior colliculi of the mesencephalon, or for singular, it will be the superior colliculus of the mesencephalon. And again, that's parented back to the mesencephalon. Just inferior to the superior colliculi of the mesencephalon, we also have two similar bulbs just inferior to them, and these can be called inferior colliculus or inferior colliculi. Now there's a term that groups these four landmarks into one single term. So if you're referring to all four of these bumps located on the mesencephalon, you can call it the corpora quadrigemina of the mesencephalon. Awesome. Now there's one more term that we need to learn that's located in the mesencephalon, and it is this space located right here. There is a space that feeds into the fourth ventricle, and in fact it's probably easier to see in the other image. So again, returning to this first image, we can see the corpora quadrigemina of the mesencephalon located right here. But we can also see this passageway, like I was saying, that leads to the fourth ventricle, which is located right here. This passageway is called the mesencephalic aqueduct. Another appropriate way of naming this passageway is called the cerebral aqueduct. Awesome, and those are all the landmarks that we need to know for the mesencephalon. So let's go ahead and move on to the cerebellum. So in this image, we see a posterior view of the cerebellum which gives us a perfect opportunity to point out some important landmarks. The first thing I want to point out is that, like the cerebrum, the cerebellum has a left and a right cerebellar hemisphere, just like the cerebrum has a left and right cerebral hemisphere. Now, between the two hemispheres, we have this worm-like landmark. You can kind of use your imagination and see this kind of looks like a worm. This worm, you can say, is the connection of both hemispheres, and it's called the cerebellar vermis. And vermis means worm. The next thing I want to point out is all the bumps and grooves found on the cerebellum. Just like the cerebrum, they too also have specific names. Now the grooves, the indentations found within the cerebellum, those are called cerebellar fissures. So those are the names of the grooves, and then the mounds on top of them are called cerebellar folia. Here we could see a sagittal cut was done on this cerebellum, which allows us to see more landmarks. Looking deep within the cerebellum, we see this object that looks like a tree, and it spans throughout the entirety of the cerebellum. This tree looking like a landmark is called Arbor Vitae of the cerebellum, which means tree of life. The next landmark and the last landmark that I want to point out of the cerebellum is this connection right here to the brainstem, where the cerebellum connects to the brainstem. That is called the Cerebellar Peduncles. Perfect. Now we can go ahead and move on to the next set of landmarks. Now, just to quickly review the last term I went over, the Cerebellar Peduncles, you can see them much more clearly in this side of the image, connecting the cerebellum to the brainstem. So again, those are called Cerebellum Peduncles. Now, we already discussed what this was, and that is the pons. However, there's a landmark that's just inferior to the pons, and it's this indentation right here. It's kind of a division between the pons and the medulla oblongata. This is a sulcus, and it's called the bulbopontine sulcus. And you don't need to parent it to anything. Here we have an anterior view of the pons, as well as the cerebellum, the pituitary gland, the optic chiasm, and the medulla oblongata. On the anterior surface of the medulla oblongata, we have these two long projections that span superiorly to inferior, making their way towards the spinal cord. These two landmarks are called pyramids of the medulla oblongata. Just lateral to the pyramids of the medulla oblongata are these large bulbs. Now, they kind of, if you use your imagination, look like olives. I know it's quite a stretch to imagine these looking like olives, but these are called olives of the medulla oblongata. Now there's a groove that's separating the pyramids from the olives, located right here and also right here. The name of these grooves are called the anterolateral sulci, or sulcus for one, of the medulla oblongata. Now behind the olives is another sulcus that runs down right here, and that has a name as well. This is the posterolateral sulcus of the medulla oblongata. And those are all the landmarks located on the brainstem. We have finished all the landmarks found in the cerebellum, in the cerebrum, all the different parts of the brain. Now we can go ahead and move on to the spinal cord. In this model, we can see a transversely cut spinal cord and all the different properties and tissues surrounding it, including this cervical vertebra. Now, the first landmark I want to identify is this fold right here on the anterior aspect of the spinal cord. This fold on the anterior aspect is called the anterior median fissure of the spinal cord. And on the posterior aspect, we have a similar fold going down right here, and this is going to be called the posterior median sulcus. And it can be confusing to remember which one's the fissure, which one's the sulcus. So there's a mnemonic that goes about saying all men fear PMS. So all, anterior, men, median, fear is fissure. So that's how you remember. All men fear is anterior median fissure, and then posterior median sulcus is PMS, which is a fun little way to remember where the fissure, if the fissure is anterior, posterior, if the sulcus is anterior, posterior. Now, you can see between the anterior median fissure and the posterior median sulcus that there's a hole right here in the center of the spinal cord. This hole is called the central canal of the spinal cord. Remember, all these terms are parented back to the spinal cord. Now, something interesting about the spinal cord is that it's slightly different from the brain. The reason being is that on the brain, specifically on the cerebrum, gray matter is found on the external side of the brain, and the white matter is located in the deeper portions of the brain. In the spinal cord, however, the gray matter is located in the deeper portions of the spinal cord, and the white matter is located on the more superficial aspects of the spinal cord, which is easily illustrated right here. You can see the darker portion being the gray matter, and then the lighter portion being the white matter of the spinal cord. The gray matter of the spinal cord actually has certain landmarks located on it, and they have unique names. And right here on the anterior aspect of this gray matter of the spinal cord, right here on the anterior aspect, we have this projection kind of going towards the anterior side of the spinal cord. That's going to be called the anterior horn of the spinal cord, or you can call it the anterior gray column of the spinal cord. Similarly, we also have these posterior horns or posterior gray columns of the spinal cord located right here. And just remember, it's posterior horn of the spinal cord or posterior gray column. It's not posterior gray horn, and it's not posterior horn column. It's either posterior horn of the spinal cord or posterior gray column of the spinal cord. And the same goes for the anterior horn of the spinal cord. Now, in certain parts of the spinal cord, they also have this lateral projection coming out here. And just like the other two, those are going to be called lateral horns or lateral gray columns of the spinal cord. The white matter of the spinal cord also have particular regions that have names. Right here, between the anterior horn of the spinal cord and the anterior median fissure of the spinal cord, we have this region right here that I'm coloring in green, and it's found on both sides. And this right here is called anterior funiculus, or funiculi for plural, of the spinal cord. And just like the posterior and lateral horns of the spinal cord, we also have posterior and lateral funiculus of the spinal cord. I'll just go ahead and color those in. So this red is representing the lateral funiculus of the spinal cord, and this yellow is going to represent the posterior funiculus of the spinal cord. And don't forget, all these landmarks that I've written down are parented back to the spinal cord. Now there are two more landmarks that I'm going to show you on a different image located right here. Now, right here we have the spinal cord towards the trunk and the abdomen. And if you see right here, you see this pointy part of the spinal cord coming down right here. I'm coloring it in black. So it comes down to a point, and then after that point, you see all these individual nerves kind of coming out of it, like so, like all this red lines that I'm drawing down. Where the spinal cord comes to a point, that is called conus medullaris, or medullary cone, of the spinal cord. And these individual nerves coming out of the conus medullaris of the spinal cord is called quada equina, which means horse tail. Now, the quada equina is not parented to the spinal cord because the spinal cord actually ends at the conus medullaris. And those are all the different landmarks that I have for the spinal cord. And we're actually pretty close to all the different landmarks located in the CNS. However, there are a handful of other landmarks that I need to point out to you in these next few images. Right here we can see in this diagram different layers found within the skull. And this is actually a really helpful image that illustrates these points. So the most superficial part of the skull is obviously the skull, but just deep to the skull is a connective tissue material called Dura Mater. Now Dura Mater is, it feels like paper, and it has a paper-like texture to it on a real specimen, and it encapsulates the entirety of the brain. And just deep to the Dura Mater is arachnoid mater, and the arachnoid mater has this little space underneath it that's called subarachnoid space. And then in the subarachnoid space, like this image shows, a lot of vasculature, like blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and veins are within this space. And just after the subarachnoid space is the pia mater. And the pia mater is directly on the brain. It can't be separated from the brain. So the pia mater is directly on the brain. And then just deep to the pia mater is the brain itself. Now, there are certain different parts of the Dura Mater specifically that are unique to other parts of the Dura Mater that actually have names. And I'm going to go ahead and identify those to you right now. So right here, you can see this gray connective tissue coming from the longitudinal cerebral fissure, as well as other parts of the brain. You got to remember that this is Dura Mater, and Dura Mater does cover the entirety of the brain, but these are the more unique parts of the Dura Mater. So don't think that the brain looks like this. Dura Mater does cover the entirety of the brain, but these are more unique parts of the Dura Mater that they've isolated for us to learn. Right here on the top part, going through the longitudinal cerebral fissure, is actually called Valk Cerebri. Now this Valk Cerebri means scythe-like. So it looks like a scythe. If we remove the left cerebral hemisphere, it would look like a scythe-like shape. So that's why they call it Valk Cerebri. Now, just like Valk Cerebri looks like a scythe going through the cerebrum, we have another scythe-like structure going through the cerebellum, and this is called Valk Cerebelli. Now, the Dura Mater that separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum also has a name, and it's called Tentorium cerebelli, meaning roof of the cerebellum. Awesome. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove the left cerebral hemisphere from this image to show you the Valk Cerebri and the different parts of this Dura Mater in its entirety. So again, right here, you can kind of see that scythe shape that I was talking about earlier with this Valk Cerebri. And also within the Valk Cerebelli, and you can also see clearly the Tentorium cerebelli as well. However, in this particular image, it fails to show you one last piece of Dura Mater that's fairly important, and it actually is underneath the pituitary gland. So I'm going to go ahead and pretend that this white half circle that I'm drawing represents the Dura Mater underneath the pituitary gland. This Dura Mater that acts almost like a diaphragm, like the diaphragm underneath our lungs, is called diaphragma cellae. And again, it goes around and kind of encapsulates the pituitary gland. Awesome, and those are all the different unique parts of the Dura Mater that are around our brains. Now, the last landmark I want to show you is actually located on a model. So this is the last landmark that we'll learn in this video. And here I have a picture of an anatomy model of a sagittally cut face. So we can see a lot of the different terminologies that we've learned. We can see the pituitary gland right here. We can see a mammillary body here. Here's the pons. Here's the mesencephalic aqueduct. We have the cerebellum. Here's the optic chiasm. Here's the fornix of the cerebellum. I can go on and we can just review all the different landmarks that we learned in the first video. However, a difference from this picture, from the pictures I showed in my first video, there's an additional landmark that's not shown on the images in my last video. And it's located right here. This bluish, reddish, venous-like structure right here, kind of on the epithalamus. This structure is called the choroid plexus. Primarily, the choroid plexus is located in the ventricles. The choroid plexus is important because it secretes CSF, or cerebrospinal fluid, which acts as a buffer between our brain and the skull, which is pretty important considering how much we move our heads and run and jump and stuff like that. That CSF protects our brain from hitting all the different parts of our skull. And we have finished covering all the different landmarks found in the CNS. I hope this video was helpful and you guys stay safe. Take care.